Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The city never slept, and neither did Kale. Even in the dead of night, the streets were alive with the hum of voices, the shuffle of feet, and the low murmur of market stalls. Shadows clung to every corner, moving with the flicker of lantern light. This was his world, where darkness offered both refuge and danger. Kale darted through the narrow alleys like a ghost, his eyes sharp, his steps silent. He had lived on these streets for as long as he could remember, stealing what he needed to survive, avoiding those who would do worse than steal from him. His clothes were tattered, his hair a tangled mess, but his instincts were razor sharp. It was these instincts that kept him alive in the shadows of a city that had no mercy for the weak. He slipped into the crowded marketplace, his gaze scanning the vendors as they packed away their goods. His stomach growled. A loaf of bread sat unattended on a cart just a few feet away. Too easy. He moved in without thinking, his fingers light as air, reaching for the loaf, but just as his hand closed around the bread, he felt it, a presence. Someone was watching him. His heart skipped, and he spun on his heel, ready to disappear into the crowd, but it was too late. A man stood before him, his face hidden beneath the hood of a dark cloak. His eyes glinted in the dim light, and for a moment, Kale felt like he was staring into the abyss itself. He backed away, but the man didn't move. He just watched, silent and still, like a predator waiting for its prey to make the wrong move. Kale's mind raced. He could run, he was fast enough, he knew the alleys well enough, but something about this man held him in place. There was no malice in the man's gaze, only a cold, calculating interest. "You've got quick hands," the man said, his voice a low rumble. "But you'll need more than that to survive." Kale swallowed hard, but said nothing. He was used to threats. They didn't scare him, not anymore. But this man was different. There was something unnerving in the way he stood, so still, like the shadows themselves clung to him. "I can offer you more than just bread," the man continued, taking a step closer. "A purpose. Power. You can leave these streets behind and become something more." Kale's chest tightened. More? There was nothing more than this. There couldn't be. He had known nothing but the streets, no family, no future. The idea of something beyond survival felt like a cruel joke. "Or you can stay here," the man said, his voice smooth but hard as iron. "Starve. Steal. Die in some alleyway with no name and no one to care." Kale's pulse quickened. He knew the man was right. There was no future for him in the streets, no end but an empty, forgotten death. But this offer, this strange promise of power, it felt dangerous. Yet, for the first time, he saw a flicker of hope, dim but present, in the dark. "What's the catch?" Kale asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. The man smiled, a shadow of a grin that barely touched his lips. "The catch is survival. If you can survive the training, the trials, then you will become one of us." A shadow dancer. Kale blinked. He had heard of them, the assassins who moved through the city like ghosts, unseen and untouchable, feared by all. They were legend, whispers on the wind, but he had never believed they were real. And now one stood before him, offering him a place among them. The choice wasn't really a choice. Kale nodded, once, and the man's smile grew ever so slightly. "Good," he said. "Come with me." Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows. Kale hesitated for only a moment before following, his heart pounding in his chest. The streets he knew faded away, replaced by twisting alleys and hidden pathways. The city around him seemed to shift, and soon Kale was lost in the labyrinth, his only guide the silent figure ahead of him. They arrived at an unmarked door, nestled between two crumbling buildings. The man knocked twice, and the door swung open with a creak. Beyond lay darkness, thick, impenetrable, and suffocating. Kale hesitated on the threshold, his instinct screaming at him to turn back, but the man glanced over his shoulder and gave him a single, sharp nod. Kale stepped through the door. The world beyond was unlike anything he had known. The Sanctum of Shadows was vast, a sprawling fortress hidden beneath the city itself, carved from stone and veiled in eternal twilight. Shadows clung to every corner, and the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and flickering torches. Figures moved in the gloom, silent and deadly, their faces obscured by hoods and masks. "Welcome to your new life," the man said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Here, you will train. Here, you will either become one of us or die in the attempt." Kale's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to nod. He had known this was coming. This was the price of power. The price of leaving the streets behind. If he had to risk his life to claim it, so be it. The man, now Kale's handler and guide, led him through the sanctum, explaining the rules in clipped tones. There were no names here, only titles. No friends, only rivals. Trust no one, for the weak were culled without hesitation. The shadow dancers lived by one rule: survive at all costs. Training began immediately. Kale was thrown into a brutal regimen, designed to break both body and mind. Days blurred together as he was pushed to his limits. They taught him to fight, to kill without hesitation. He learned to move like a shadow, to disappear into the dark, to blend into light and strike when least expected. His body ached, his mind screamed, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every failure meant punishment, sometimes worse than death. The other recruits were as fierce as the training itself. Lyra, a slender girl with eyes as sharp as her blades, became a reluctant ally. They shared meals and the occasional conversation, but Kale knew better than to trust her completely. She, too, was fighting to survive. Thorn, on the other hand, was a different kind of danger. Tall and broad-shouldered, Thorn had a sadistic streak, enjoying the pain of others far too much. From the moment they crossed paths, Thorn saw Kale as competition, and their rivalry only grew with each passing trial point. One night, during a particularly grueling test, Kale found himself trapped in a maze of shifting shadows, the only way out hidden behind a dozen traps and puzzles. He was close, he could feel it, when Thorn appeared, grinning like a wolf. "Looks like you're having trouble," Thorn sneered, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Need some help?" Kale narrowed his eyes, his heart pounding. He knew better than to trust Thorn's offer. "I'll manage," he said, his voice cold. Thorn chuckled. "Suit yourself. But just so you know," he stepped forward, a wicked glint in his eye. "The way out's right behind me." Kale's muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at him to attack, but he held back. Thorn was goading him, trying to force a mistake. "Come on," Thorn taunted, stepping even closer. "Or are you too scared to fight me?" Kale's hand twitched towards his blade, but before he could make a move, Thorn lunged. The fight was fast and brutal, blades flashing in the dim light, bodies colliding with bone-crunching force. Kale's training kicked in, every move precise, every strike deadly. But Thorn was strong, stronger than Kale had anticipated. The fight ended in a deadlock, both of them bloodied and panting. Thorn, for once, wasn't smiling. He glared at Kale, his lips curling into a snarl. "This isn't over," he spat before vanishing into the shadows. Kale wiped the blood from his lip, watching as Thorn disappeared into the shadows. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had survived another day, another trial, but the battle against Thorn had made one thing clear: he could not let his guard down for a moment. In the Shadow Dancers, there was no such thing as safety. Only survival. The training continued with an unforgiving pace, each day blending into the next. Master Rai pushed them harder than ever, his eyes cold as he watched the initiates struggle through relentless drills. Kale's body ached with every movement, his limbs heavy, but he never stopped. He couldn't afford to. The thought of failure, of being culled like the others, kept him moving long after his body begged for rest. It was during these grueling days that Kale began to notice the cracks in the organization's armor. He had always been observant, a skill that had served him well on the streets, and now it was revealing truths he wasn't sure he wanted to see. The Shadow Dancers were not just an elite group of assassins, there was something more. Conversations whispered in the dark corners of the sanctum hinted at secret agendas, at the true purpose of their missions. It became clear to Kale that the elders, the unseen leaders of the organization, were pulling the strings in ways that went far beyond simple mercenary work. That he kept his suspicions to himself, but the weight of the knowledge grew heavier with each passing day. There was a rot in the heart of the Shadow Dancers, a darkness that went deeper than he had realized. But how could he escape? How could he free himself from an organization that was built on shadows, where even the walls seemed to have eyes? It was Lyra who finally voiced what Kale had been thinking all along. One night, after a particularly brutal session with Master Rai, they sat together in the cold, dimly lit training hall, their bodies bruised and aching. Lyra stared at the floor, her voice low as she spoke. "They're not what they seem, you know." Kale didn't need to ask who she meant. "I've noticed." Lyra glanced at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I don't trust them. The elders, they're planning something. Something big. Bigger than any of us." Kale nodded, his mind racing. He had seen the same signs, the sudden increase in missions, the secrecy, the way the higher-ranking members spoke in hushed tones whenever the elders were mentioned. "They're using us," Lyra continued, her voice shaking. "We're just pawns in whatever game they're playing." Kale clenched his fists. The thought of being manipulated, of being nothing more than a tool in someone else's hands, made his blood boil. But what could they do? The Shadow Dancers were everywhere, their reach extending far beyond the sanctum. Escaping would mean death. Staying meant being complicit in whatever dark plan the elders were weaving. "I'm not going to let them control me," Lyra said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We need to get out, Kale. We need to leave before it's too late." Kale's heart pounded in his chest. The idea of escaping, of breaking free from the organization that had taken everything from him, was both thrilling and terrifying. But could they really do it? Could they survive outside the shadows? Before he could respond, the doors to the hall creaked open, and Master Rai stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the two of them. Kale and Lyra immediately stood, their conversation cut short. Rai's eyes lingered on them for a moment, suspicion flickering in his gaze, but he said nothing. Instead, he ordered them to follow. They were being sent on another mission. The mission was unlike any they had faced before. Kale, Lyra, and several other initiates were tasked with infiltrating the royal palace of a nearby kingdom. The target, the king himself. The assassination, they were told, would destabilize the region, creating chaos that the elders could manipulate to their advantage. But as Kale listened to the plan, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. This wasn't just another mission. This was part of something much larger, something that would leave the region in ruins. The journey to the palace was tense, each of them aware that this mission was a test, a final test to prove their loyalty to the shadow dancers. But for Kale, it was something else entirely. It was a chance to make a decision, a chance to choose between the path laid out for him by the elders and the path to freedom. As they neared the palace, Kale's mind raced. Could he go through with it? Could he take the life of a man who had no idea of the storm heading his way? His training told him that hesitation meant death, but his conscience screamed at him to stop, to find another way. The night of the assassination arrived, and the group moved like shadows through the palace. Kale's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the king's chambers. This was it, the moment of truth. He could feel Lyra's gaze on him, could sense her own hesitation. She was waiting for him to make a move, to show her that there was still a way out. Kale's breath hitched as they reached the king's door. His hand trembled as he reached for his blade, but before he could act, a voice echoed in his mind. It was Lyra, her whisper barely audible but filled with desperation. "We can't do this." Kale's heart raced. He glanced at her, saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had been gnawing at him for days. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. Without a second thought, Kale stepped away from the door, his hand falling from his blade. He turned to the others, his voice low but firm. "Abort the mission." The other initiates stared at him in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. But before they could react, Kale moved, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her back into the shadows. They had only seconds before the others realized what was happening. Before the palace guards were alerted, they ran. The palace was a maze of corridors and stairways, but Kale's training had prepared him for this. He and Lyra moved like shadows, slipping past guards and ducking into hidden alcoves. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. They burst through a hidden passage, the cool night air hitting them like a slap to the face. But they weren't safe yet. The shadow dancers would hunt them, would never stop until they were either dead or brought back to face the consequences of their betrayal. Kale's mind raced as they sprinted through the forests surrounding the palace. He could hear the hounds baying in the distance, could feel the eyes of his former comrades on his back. There was no turning back now. They had made their choice, and it was one they would have to live with. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Kale and Lyra stumbled into a small clearing, their bodies exhausted, their breaths ragged. They collapsed to the ground, the weight of their decision settling on their shoulders like a heavy cloak. "We can't stop," Kale gasped, his voice hoarse. "They'll find us." Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "I know. But we have to keep moving." Kale glanced around the clearing, his mind racing with possibilities. They needed a plan, a way to disappear completely. The shadow dancers had eyes and ears everywhere, and without a solid plan, they were as good as dead. But Kale wasn't ready to give up. "Not yet. We'll find a way," he said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "We'll disappear. We'll survive." Lyra looked at him, her expression softening. "I trust you, Kale." For the first time in what felt like years, Kale allowed himself to smile, even if only for a moment. They had made their choice, and while the road ahead was uncertain, they were free. But as they moved deeper into the forest, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. The shadow dancers would come for them, of that he was certain. And when they did, Kale would be ready. He had learned to survive in the shadows. Now, he would learn to fight in the light.